The tin is cold in my hands. Not the cold of a March cellar, though that is there too. That particular damp that settles into limestone and never fully leaves. Not in 40 years. Not in 60. This is a different cold. The cold of a thing sealed away before I was old enough to read. Left in the dark while I was busy being a girl, then a wife, then a widow, then whatever it is I am now. 78 years old. Still here. Still on this land. I am standing in a room I did not know existed until 20 minutes ago. 6 feet by 8 feet, roughly. The ceiling is low enough that I had to duck coming through the gap in the limestone, and I am not a tall woman. The walls are dry stacked the same as the rest of the root cellar. The same gray Harlan County stone my grandfather pulled out of this hillside with a mule team and his own 2 hands. But in here the air is different, stiller, like it has been holding its breath. Behind me, through the hole I made by working loose the 4th side of what I had always taken for a solid wall, the root cellar opens back toward the oak door, and the iron hinges and the hillside and the farm. Above, somewhere past the slanted cellar door, I propped open with the same fence post I have used for 30 years. The sky is the pale, cold gray of a Kentucky March morning. A single shaft of that gray light reaches down and cuts across the earthen floor at my feet. At my feet, an oilskin bundle, flat, rectangular, tied with a piece of cord so old it has gone almost black. I have not touched it yet. I will, but not yet. Right now, it is the tin I cannot put down. Edgeworth ready-rubbed pipe tobacco, red label, cream lettering, a little oval portrait of a gentleman who looks entirely unconcerned with the year 1987. The lid has been sealed, not with wax, but with a careful wrapping of electrical tape that has dried and cracked at the edges without letting go. Someone took time with this. Someone wanted it to stay closed. I have lived on this farm my entire life. Born in the back bedroom of the house above me, married in the yard, widowed in the kitchen. I have used this root cellar every autumn since I was old enough to carry a jar without dropping it. I have lined these walls with mason jars of green beans and pickled beets and apple butter and corn. I have stood in this cellar in July heat and February dark and every season between, and I did not know this room was here. My grandfather built this cellar in 1919. He has been dead since 1953. Whatever is in this tin, he meant it to wait. The question I cannot yet answer is whether he meant it to wait for me. I set the tin down on the limestone shelf where I keep the oldest jars, the ones I haven't opened in years but haven't been able to throw away either, and I let myself stand still for a moment. The lantern makes a small warm circle in the cold air. Outside, somewhere up the hill, one of the Dominiques has gotten herself onto the wrong side of the fence again. I can hear her complaining about it. I let her complain. It was February when it started. The 6th, a Saturday. Though my nephew did not call ahead to tell me he was coming. That is his way. He arrives like weather, like something you should have been prepared for. I heard the truck on the road before I saw it, and then I saw it, and then I saw the second truck behind it, and a man I did not recognize climbing out of the passenger side with a canvas case under his arm. My nephew is not a cruel man. I want to be fair about that. He brought me a bag of groceries from the IGA in Elton, coffee, a tin of soup, a box of crackers, and he set them on the kitchen table and looked around the kitchen the way men look at old things they have already decided are too far gone to fix. He had on a new coat. The man with the canvas case waited by the trucks. He said he had been doing some thinking. He said he had talked to a lawyer in Harlan and to a man at the county who handles land assessments, and that there was a way to help me. That was the word he used. Help. That would set me up comfortable for whatever years I had left. He said 120 acres was a lot for a woman my age. He said it without any particular meanness, the way you'd say a snowfall was heavy, as if it were simply a condition of the weather. 4 parcels, he said. Sold separately, they'd bring enough to put me somewhere with people around, somewhere I wouldn't have to worry about the furnace or the roof or the truck. He had a folder. He set it on top of the crackers. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the front room. I did not sit down, because sitting down would have meant settling in for a conversation, and I had not yet decided what kind of conversation this was going to be. I looked at the folder. I looked at the man outside with the canvas case, who was already walking the fence line along the east pasture, his breath making small clouds in the February air. My nephew watched me, and I suppose my silence looked like consideration. It was not consideration. It was something older than that. The particular stillness of a woman who has learned that speaking too soon costs more than waiting. I told him I'd think on it. He took that for agreement. He left before noon. I heard the rental car back out, down the gravel, and I stood at the kitchen window until the sound of it faded past the ridge. Then I poured the rest of the coffee, still warm, and sat down at the table where his folder still lay on top of my crackers. I did not open it. I have known this land for 53 years, which is longer than my nephew has been alive. I came to it as a bride in June of 1952, 23 years old. In a yellow dress I made myself from a simplicity pattern. Earl was 32 and already weathered in the way a man gets weathered when he was raised working. We had the ceremony in the Baptist church in Elton on a Saturday and were back on the farm by Sunday morning because the hay was ready, and the hay does not wait for honeymoons. We worked it together for 19 years. There were mornings in the late 50s when we had 11 dairy cows, 2 pigs, 40 chickens, and a mule named Burden who was exactly as difficult as his name suggested. Earl and I turned 60 acres of bottomland every spring with a Farmall H that still sits in the back of the equipment shed, older than our marriage and still running mostly, with patience and the right parts from Carol's Feed and Hardware. We grew corn and hay and kitchen garden vegetables and whatever the land would give us in a good year. We repaired what broke. We paid what we owed, usually on time, sometimes close. We were not wealthy people, and we did not expect to be. Earl died on a Tuesday in September of 1971. Heart attack, 61 years old, in the east pasture. I found him in the afternoon. After that, I was alone on 120 acres, 58 years old, and I had a choice about what kind of woman I was going to be. I decided I was going to be the same kind I had always been, which is the kind that gets up in the morning and does the work. That was 16 years ago. I have run this place alone since then. In 1987, I keep 3 dairy cows, Alma, Ruth, and one I call Patience, 14 laying hens, and an old border collie named Hex, who is 12 years old and mostly sleeps, but still follows me to the barn every morning. Out of habit or loyalty, I have never been sure which. I still turn the bottomland with the Farmall. I still put up preserves in August. I have filled 22 black and white composition notebooks since 1951, one entry most every day, and I am 4 months into the 23rd. I know every acre of what I have. I know where it floods in a wet April and where the soil turns sandy along the creek cut and where my grandfather planted the first fence posts in 1898, which is why I knew, that February afternoon, that the folder on my table was not the whole story. The bill came on a Monday, March the 2nd, 1987, and the ground still hard with the last of February's cold. I heard the mail truck on the road before I saw it. Virgil Combs had driven that route for 11 years, and I knew the particular groan of his engine on the grade, and I walked down to the box in my barn coat and rubber boots, the mud along the drive starting to soften at the surface but still iron underneath. The envelope was from the Harlan County Property Assessment Office. I did not need to open it to know what it was. I had been expecting it. I brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table beside my coffee cup, and opened it with the same paring knife I use for everything. $318.40, due by April 15th. They had printed it in that particular official font that is designed, I think, to make the number look larger than it is. It did not need any help. $318.40 was a significant sum to me in March of 1987. I sat down. I got my notebook from the shelf, number 23, 4 months in, and I opened it to a clean page and wrote the date at the top, the way I always do. Then I wrote down the number. Then I wrote down every other number I could account for. What I had in the checking account at First Harlan Bank, $87 and some change. What I expected from the dairy co-op pickup at the end of March, likely 60, maybe 70, depending on butterfat. What I had in the coffee can on the second shelf of the pantry, $19 and a few quarters. I added the columns twice. The second time gave me the same answer as the first, which is what usually happens when the news is bad. I was not panicked. I want to be clear about that. Panic belongs to people who have not yet learned that most problems have a practical face, if you will look at them long enough without flinching. I had been looking at hard numbers across a kitchen table since before that particular font was invented. What I had was preserves. 2 full shelves of quarts in the root cellar, tomatoes, green beans, apple butter, bread and butter pickles, blackberry jam. I had put up 41 quarts of tomatoes alone in August. The Elton Farmers Market ran on the first and third Saturday of each month, even in March, even in weather. People bought preserves all winter. They bought them especially in March, when their own stores were running thin, and spring felt like a rumor. I finished my coffee. I put the bill and my notebook side by side on the table. Then I pulled on my coat, picked up the flashlight from the hook by the back door, and went out to take stock of what I had. The root cellar sits 32 steps from the back door of the farmhouse, built into the hillside, so that the hill itself does the work of keeping things cold. My grandfather understood that. He understood a great many things about letting the land do the work if you positioned yourself correctly inside it. I went down the 3 stone steps and pulled the oak door open on its iron hinges. They need oil every October and every March, and I had oiled them in October, so they moved, and stood for a moment inside the entrance, letting my eyes adjust. I had not brought a lantern. The flashlight would do. The shelves along the east wall held what I had counted in my head: 41 quarts of tomatoes, 14 of green beans, 9 of apple butter, 11 of bread and butter pickles, and 7 of blackberry jam. 82 jars in total. I made a note of this in my head, the way a person learns to do when she has been doing inventory alone for 16 years. I moved deeper into the cellar. It runs back about 18 feet, narrowing toward the far wall where the hill presses in. I keep the potatoes in the back, in wooden crates lined with straw, and I wanted to see how many were still sound. That is what brought me to the back wall on the morning of March 7th, 1987, which was a Saturday and cold enough that I could see my breath in the flashlight beam. I was counting through the crates. The third one had some soft ones I would need to pull, when the light crossed the limestone wall and stopped my hand. I have stood in that cellar 1,000 times. More, I have stood there in every season, in grief and in ordinary tiredness, in the dead of January when the pipes needed watching. But I had always looked at the wall the way you look at a thing you are certain of, without actually seeing it. This time I saw it. The stones along the back wall run in roughly horizontal courses, the way dry stacked limestone does, fitted by hand with the patience of someone who had all winter. But there was a section, perhaps 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall, where the courses did not line up with those beside them. A slight offset, not wrong enough to trouble, not right enough to ignore, once you had noticed. I raised the flashlight and moved closer. The mortar on the top of the section was the same gray-white as the rest. Same on the left side, same on the right. Old mortar, hard as the stone itself, fitted in there sometime before I was born. I put my palm flat against the bottom course of that section, just below knee height, pressing the way you press a door you suspect is not latched. There was a give. Not much. A 1/4 inch, maybe less. But stone mortared on all 4 sides does not give. I did not move my hand. I did not move my hand for a long moment, just stood there in the cold, the flashlight beam cutting sideways across the stone, feeling that small, impossible give against my palm like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. Then I went to get the pry bar. It was hanging on 2 nails inside the barn door, where it had always hung, a 30-inch crowbar with a worn curve at the end that my husband had wrapped in electrical tape sometime in the late 60s to improve his grip. The tape was brittle now, cracked through in places, but I have never replaced it. I walked back across the yard in my barn coat, the cold sharp enough to see my breath, and went down into the root cellar without hurrying. That is the only way I know how to do a thing I have never done before, without hurrying. I worked the flat end of the bar into the bottom seam of that 4-foot section, where the lowest course of stone met the earthen floor. It took 3 attempts to find the line where it would catch. When it did, and I leaned my weight into the handle, there was a sound I have no other word for but releasing. Not breaking, not cracking, but the sound a thing makes when it has been held against itself for a very long time and is finally permitted to stop. The bottom stone rocked outward, 1 inch, 2 inches. Then I could get my fingers under it. I worked for the better part of that morning, stone by stone, setting each one to the side in the order I removed it, because my grandfather had fitted them that way and they would go back the same way. I was not thinking far ahead. I was thinking about the work directly in front of me. When the opening was large enough to put a lantern through, I did, and then I smelled it. Dry, cool, and beneath that coolness, something else, something sweet and old and utterly still, the way tobacco smells, not when it is burning, but when it has been sealed away in the dark. For so long, it has become almost a memory of itself, like a room that had been holding its breath since before I was born. That is exactly what it was like. I stood at the opening and breathed it in, and did not go through immediately. When I did go through, ducking under the low header stone, the lantern showed me a space roughly 6 feet wide and 8 feet deep. The walls rough limestone, the floor the same packed clay as the outer cellar. Dry, no water damage, no rot. On a low timber shelf along the back wall, arranged with the care of someone who expected them to be found one day by someone worthy of finding them, were 3 things: a tin, an oilskin bundle, and a folded paper, tied with cotton string gone yellow with age. I knelt down in front of them and did not touch anything yet. I carried them out one at a time, the way you'd carry eggs. Set them on the kitchen table without unwrapping anything, got the coffee going, and stood at the window for a moment, watching the light shift across the south pasture. It was late morning by then. The rooster had long since finished his opinion of the day. I opened the oilskin bundle first. The wrapping was tight, folded in on itself with the particular care of someone who had learned, probably the hard way, what moisture could do to paper over time. Inside were 5 notebooks, not composition books like mine, but smaller ones, the kind sold at dry goods stores in the 20s and 30s, narrow-ruled, bound with thin cardboard covers that had gone the color of old cream. Each one had a year written on the front in pencil, pressed hard enough that the numerals had nearly cut through. 1926, 1931, 1938, 1947. His handwriting was cramped and careful, the letters close together, the way a man writes when he has learned to be sparing with everything, including paper. The first entry in the 1921 journal was dated April 3rd, and it read, "Light frost overnight. Ground broke clean along the east slope. Planted the blue Aztec corn in the lower 40, 3 pounds of seed. Should do." Should do. I sat with that for a moment. He logged everything, not just plantings and yields, but the color of the sky before a rain, the day a milk cow came in with her first calf, the price he got for tobacco at the co-op in Elton, a note that the upper spring had run slow all of August. He wrote in pounds and inches and cents. He wrote, "Cold came early this year and did not apologize for it." He wrote, "The girls helped with the harvest. They are good workers. I did not tell them often enough." I had to put that one down for a minute. He had died in 1953, when I was 44 years old. I had known him only as an old man with a wide-brimmed hat and the slowest walk I had ever seen, a man who had already given over most of the running of the place to my husband by then, who sat on the porch in the evenings and did not say much. I had not known this man, this earlier man, the one who broke the east slope with a mule in April of 1921, and wrote, "Should do," as though the whole season were something that simply needed encouraging. 2 hours passed without me noticing them pass. The coffee went cold. I refilled it without getting up properly, just stretching across to the percolator on the counter, the way you do when you don't want to break the spell of something. By the time I reached the 1931 journal, I had forgotten entirely about the folded paper still lying on the table, still tied with its yellow string. The tin was heavier than I expected. I don't know why that surprised me. An Edgeworth tin is just a tin, red label, the familiar oval, the kind that used to sit on every mantelpiece in eastern Kentucky when the men still rolled their own. But I had carried it up from the cellar, wrapped under my arm like something breakable, and setting it on the table I felt the weight shift, felt something dense and flat move inside it, and I stood there with both hands on the lid for a long moment before I opened it. The seal had dried to almost nothing. The lid came off with one soft pop. The bills were folded lengthwise and bound with a rubber band that had long since fused to itself, cracked and dark. I worked it off carefully. They were silver certificates, the old ones, the 1928 and 1934 series, crisp in the way that old money gets when it has been sealed away from air for decades, slightly waxy to the touch, the blue seal and the blue serial numbers still vivid against the pale green. I counted them once, then smoothed them flat on the table and counted them again. $340 exactly. Nothing more, nothing less. Beneath the bills, folded into a square no bigger than my palm, was a piece of paper. Not the legal document. That was still on the table with its yellow string. This was something else. A hand-drawn map of the farm, penciled onto paper that had gone the color of weak tea, the lines still steady and sure. He had drawn the full 120 acres, the east slope, the creek bend, the road, the farmhouse square with its small rectangle for the porch. The root cellar was there, marked with careful cross-hatching, and behind it, slightly offset, a second rectangle, smaller, with a single X drawn through it. In the bottom corner, in handwriting I now recognized from 5 journals, C. Rye, 1931. I sat back in my chair. He had not forgotten this room. He had not sealed it up in a moment of old age and lost the memory of it, the way people lose things at the end. He had drawn a map. He had put the map inside the tin. He had put the tin inside the room and sealed the wall in front of it. And then he had gone on living for 22 more years and said nothing to anyone that any of us had ever heard. That was deliberate. Every part of it, the placement of the tin, the map inside it, the money counted to the dollar, was a decision made by a man who knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it in silence. The kitchen went dark around me. I hadn't turned on the overhead light. I sat with the map open under my hands while the last of the February evening left the window, and I thought about what a man hides on purpose and why. The map was the last thing I looked at for a long time. Then I reached back into the tin and took out the folded paper I had set aside when the money and the map first fell into my hands. The one that felt stiffer than the others, folded in thirds the way a lawyer folds things, the way documents come back to you from offices with their own particular gravity. I unfolded it carefully. The paper had gone the color of old cream, and the ink had faded to a reddish brown, but the handwriting was clear enough, copperplate, careful, the kind of hand that had been trained by someone who meant it to last. I read the first line twice. Then I set it flat on the table and went to the parlor and came back with the dictionary, the big one, the Webster's from 1962, that had been Earl's, the spine held together now with electrical tape. I worked through it slowly. There was language in there I had never needed before. Conveyance, restriction in perpetuity, direct lineal female heir. I looked up each word I was uncertain of and wrote the plain meaning in the margin of my notebook in pencil, the way I had done with difficult passages my whole life, the way my mother had taught me to treat a sentence I didn't yet understand, not as a wall, but as a door I hadn't opened all the way. It took me the better part of an hour. When I had finished, I sat with both hands flat on the table, one on the dictionary and one on the document, and I read the full thing through again from the beginning, with all the words translated into plain speech in my own mind. No subdivision of the described 120 acres without written consent of a direct female heir of the grantor. Filed March 4, 1931, Harlan County Clerk's Office, Book 14, page 202. My grandfather had written that clause into the deed of this land 56 years before my nephew filed his survey. He had written it in a year when he had 3 daughters and no sons, and he had known exactly what that meant for every year that came after. He had filed it quietly, said nothing, and then gone on farming. I sat very still for a while. Then something started in my chest, not grief, not anger, something I hadn't felt in a long time, something that rose up before I could think to stop it. I laughed. Not the polite kind, not the tired kind. The real kind, alone in my dark kitchen in February, with an old man's handwriting spread open in front of me, laughing the way you do when something has been true the whole time, and you've only just been given permission to know it. That night, I slept more solidly than I had in months. Sunday morning, I was up before light, as usual, fed the chickens, checked on the 2 goats, stood in the cold yard for a moment, listening to the creek run down past the lower pasture. The sky had that pale silver look it gets in February, just before the sun breaks the ridgeline. I went inside, put on my good wool coat, the dark one, not the barn coat, and found the telephone book under the counter where it had been since 1984. The county clerk's office was listed on one line. It did not open Sundays. I already knew that. I wrote down the address anyway, in the margin of that morning's notebook page, tore it out, and tucked it in my coat pocket. I drove into Elton anyway. The F-100 ran cold for the first 2 miles, the heater just beginning to push warmth by the time I passed the Falk mailbox and turned onto the county road. 7 miles. I had driven that stretch so many times I no longer counted the curves, just let the truck find them. The town was quiet, the diner showing one lit window, a dog crossing the road near the post office without hurrying. I drove past the courthouse square and found the clerk's office, a low brick annex attached to the east side of the courthouse, and sat in the parking lot looking at the locked door for a few minutes. Then I went to the diner and had coffee and eggs and waited for Monday. Monday I was there at 8 o'clock when a young man in a canvas jacket unlocked the front door. He looked at me the way young people sometimes do, politely, waiting for me to explain why I was there, probably expecting me to say I needed something notarized. I asked for Book 14, page 202. He had to go into the back for a while. He came out carrying a heavy bound ledger, setting it on the counter with both hands, and I opened it to the page myself. The amendment was there, the same language, the same date, the same hand that had written it before anyone had thought to challenge it, printed clearly across the top. Deed Amendment, Preservation Clause, Agricultural Lands. The clerk read it. He looked up at me. He said it was recorded and valid, and that there was nothing in the file indicating it had ever been superseded or contested. I thanked him. Then I told him I also had a tax bill to settle, $318.40, due April 15th, and I set the silver certificates on the counter in a small stack. He picked one up and turned it over, called for his supervisor. The supervisor was a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a chain. She came out, looked at the certificate, held it up to the fluorescent light the way you'd hold an egg. Then she pulled a binder from under the counter and found the Treasury reference page, 1934 series, legal tender. She gave me a receipt and a stamped copy of the payment record, and I folded both into my coat pocket and drove home down the mountain with the heater blowing and the radio playing something I didn't recognize but didn't mind. That night, I made a photocopy at the library in Elton. The copier costs a dime a page, and I used two, and I put one copy in my own files and folded the second into a plain envelope. I wrote his name and his address in Lexington on the front in my regular hand. My return address in the upper left corner. Nothing else inside. No letter, no explanation, no list of what he'd done wrong or what I thought of it. The deed amendment spoke clearly enough on its own. I sealed the envelope, put a stamp on it, and dropped it in the blue mailbox outside the post office on my way past. I did not wait at the window to see what might come of it. I drove home and fed the chickens. The following Sunday, Dottie came with a buttermilk pie and sat across from me at the kitchen table, the way she has for 30 years. And I told her all of it from the beginning. The loose stone, the tin, the journals, the silver certificates, the clerk reading the language of the amendment out loud. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always valued about her. When I finished, she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather was a careful man." That was all, and it was exactly right, because he had been careful in the way that people who have lost things are careful, the kind of careful that looks ahead 30 or 40 years and asks what the land might still need protecting from, long after you're gone. He didn't know what shape the trouble would take. He only knew it would come. My nephew did not call. Not that week, not the week after. By the second week of March, I received a notice from the county surveyor's office informing me that the division application filed in February had been withdrawn. The letter was 2 sentences. I read it once, set it on the table, and went out to check on the ewe who'd been favoring her left foreleg since Thursday. The ewe was fine, a little stiff in the fetlock, nothing that a few days of rest and a change in where I had her penned wouldn't sort. By the end of that week, she was walking without any favor at all. April came in, cool and dry, which is the best kind of April for this ground. The backfield, the one my grandfather broke in 1902, and every generation since has turned in the second week of the month, was ready by the 9th. I ran the tractor out on the morning of the 10th, a Friday, with the sky still pink at the edges, and turned the first row before the sun had cleared the ridge. There is a particular smell to this soil in April, dark and cold, and something beneath that, something mineral, like the rock it came from. I have never been able to describe it to anyone's satisfaction, including my own. I have smelled it every spring for 60 years, and it still catches me for a moment when it first comes up. Before the planting began, I went back into the root cellar. I brought the tin, the oilskin bundle, and the journals down the stone steps and through the gap in the false wall one more time. I set them in the smaller chamber, the way I had found them. The tin against the left wall, the bundle flat on the floor, the journals stacked with the oldest date facing out. The deed amendment I did not return. That I had already filed in the box where I keep the farm papers, between the 1954 deed of transfer and the property survey from 1962. Let it stand in the light. It has waited long enough. I set the loose stones back into the fourth side of the wall. I did not cement them. I left them as he left them, fitted close enough to look solid, but lift the second one from the bottom and the rest will follow. Then I went upstairs and made coffee and sat down with notebook number 23. I wrote one entry, the date, the weather, what I had put back and what I had kept, and one sentence about my grandfather, that he had known the trouble would come without knowing its shape, and that the preparations of careful people are almost always mistaken for nothing at all until the day they are needed. I set the notebook on the shelf beside the oilskin journals. They looked right together, old and older, in a line. So I will say this plainly, to anyone who has ever been told that a place holds nothing anymore, that the old ones left nothing worth finding, that the walls are empty and the years have taken everything, open the wall. Not every family hid their care in a deed or a tin, but most of them hid it somewhere, in a drawer nobody opened, a cellar nobody thought to look behind, a notebook stacked at the back of a shelf. The land keeps what it's given. It kept mine for 56 years and handed it back when I needed it most. I am still here. The farm is still whole. The spring planting is underway. If you have a story like this, something found, something kept, something that came back around, I would be glad to hear it in the comments. And if this was worth your time, share it with someone who knows what it is to be written off before the last word's been said.